Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ian Barnes, and I'm lecturing to you from the University of Lincoln. And today's topic is really about external trade for the UK post the UK actually leaving the European Union. Now, I really rather regret actually having said I would talk about this topic because, of course, in economics things do change, but not really quite at the speed that this whole issue of Brexit has changed. So what I've done is I've issued a warning, a warning that the situation we have here today, on the 14th of March, is unclear. So I must confess that this is very rare that this ever happens, but we have just simply no clear idea about the general direction of travel of the whole Brexit experiment. Having said that, there are some things we can say and some things which will be there for all time. So let's just go through some of those in the next few minutes while I talk about them. Well, I think the first thing to say is, okay, we need to know what Brexit is, what progress we made towards achieving it, what we know about the future trading arrangements with the European Union, and of course what we know about the trading relationships with the UK has with countries outside of Europe. So that's roughly this scene we're going to set, and I'll tell you as much as I can about those issues. Well, first of all, of course, just to talk about the organisation itself. Well, the European Union has got 28 member states, and of course once the UK leaves it will have 27 member states. I'm sure other countries will actually join it, but the UK is one of the biggest economies in the EU. It's about the same size as the French economy, slightly bigger than the Italian economy, and of course because Germany's got 82 million people, smaller than the German economy, but it's still a very important part of the overall European economic area, as it were. And of course the thing is that the UK is the sixth largest economy in the world, which is quite surprising. A lot of people think about a little island here, but actually it is very important economically right the way across the globe. Well, the UK has been a member of the EU since 1973, and then quite surprised for many people was that the UK had a referendum on membership of the European Union in 2016, and I think really the issue there was simple. The issue was, okay, will we be better off within the European Union or outside of it? However, this was a simple binary question, yes or no, but so many different things are wrapped up in that question that it's proved to be very, very difficult to actually achieve what many people hoped they could as a result of this. So here we are, nearly 3 years later, and the whole idea of exiting the European Union, that's where Brexit comes from, is still very much up in the air. Really very, very fraught and controversial issue. And of course there have been negotiations, and of course in a legal sense the situation where we have at the moment is fairly certain, in the sense that if we don't do anything about it we will actually leave, the UK will leave at 11 p.m. on the 29th of March of this year. So it's only got a few days to go, 15 more days to go. That actual situation may not actually come to fruition. It may well be that we'll actually leave somewhat later than that. It could be another 2 years beyond that, or it could be just another 2 months beyond that. So both those things are highly possible. But the thing is, of course, is that the importance of the UK is that it is that big economy, but it's also, with the European Union, the theory here is really one of which, I don't know whether it is a theory, but the idea of gravity. Actually, the European Union and the UK trade with each other a great deal. They're both very important to each other. And although there's a certain amount of impatience about the UK's attitude towards the European Union, On the other hand, of course, if indeed we make a mess of this particular process, that could be quite damaging to the European economies, but particularly, of course, very damaging to the UK economy, because breaking away from the world of the European Union will be very, very difficult and could be somewhat traumatic. Now, we have really a world which is very much more complicated than it used to be. In the past, we would be able to survive quite happily for long periods of time, well away from the economies of neighbour states. But that's a very long time ago. And of course, since 1945, we've become increasingly dependent upon international trade agreements, particularly, of course, with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1948, and of course, most recently with the World Trade Organization and its creation in 1995, and of course the European Union, which we've been part of since 1973. So we're very much creatures, really, of organizations, and that's many of the problems, because of course very few economies that are successful ever operate entirely on their own. Now, the problem here is that the UK has been a member since 1973. That's a long, long time ago. It really means that, of course, we are talking about nearly 50 years worth of membership, and of course the UK has during that time embedded all its legal and commercial trading laws within that of the European Union. So actually we have agreed all sorts of rules about the way trade will be conducted between ourselves, and the UK has been very much part of that, and of course suddenly we will no longer be part of that process. And of course the main thing to remember, of course, is that although a lot of talk about the fact that the UK will be departing, really, of course, first of all, the UK will be tied to the European economies forever, because they're the closest ones to the UK. And any negotiations will take years to actually come to fruition. Lots of people think, well, okay, you just decide to leave. If you ask many people in the street, which the UK television does, you know, oh, should we leave? Oh, yes, we should leave now. It really is not that simple. It really is not that simple. If we did try and leave in that way, the economy would move into collapse. So, at the moment, the big debate really is about not only not leaving the European Union, but what kind of deal we would actually have with them. And this is where it becomes quite complicated, because, of course, we could simply depart on the 29th of March and have no deal with the European Union at all. Under those circumstances, we would be subject to World Trade Organization rules, but however, even those are not very certain. So there is a real issue about the trading relationships. If there is a deal, however, then of course the thought was that we would have until at least the end of 2020 before we actually could bring the thing to a conclusion. Now, the forces of politics can never be taken for granted. So at the moment, of course, we're in a position whereby the UK Parliament is very, very uncertain about what it wants to do. And here we are, say, only a few days away to go. But the issue about no deal, of course, is there will be no meaningful transition. And so when we're part of the European Union, we actually had borderless trade. Goods could come from, say, a factory in Germany into southern England. Companies like, say, Honda could operate on 12 to 24-hour just-in-time provision. That will no longer be possible, because whenever goods come into the UK, they'll need to be checked. There'll be tariffs associated with many of the goods, and of course that will create bureaucratic problems. And indeed, one of the issues will be, of course, is that something like, say, the port of Dover will be or could be, clogged up. Port of Dover. 2.6 million trucks a year go in and out of the European Union by the ferries at Dover. 1.6 million trucks a year go via the rail link. So in effect, of course, over 4 million trucks actually going through a very, very narrow point. And of course, that's a pinch point. So most of the scenarios that people have actually worked out would suggest that we will have very long queues along the motorways leading to Dover, and indeed major problems about the actual where to park all the trucks as they wait to either board the ferries or indeed as they come off them. So big processing problems associated with this. Now, that's why it was important that we actually had a transition period. The transition period, of course, would depend on the negotiations, but basically the position at the moment is that the UK has actually agreed, although not ratified, arrangements to actually leave the European Union, so that it actually does it in a relatively smooth way. But Parliament has not agreed to the actual deal itself, so that's why the transition arrangements are under threat, and indeed it could well be that they'll remain under threat for the next few days. So this division is really deadlocking, I suppose, the UK political system, but also, of course, it has major threats to the economy. So if we decide to do nothing, of course, the default position is that we'll actually depart without any real deal, and of course that will be when the real trouble starts, because of course we'll have to then introduce tariffs, that's taxes on goods coming into the UK, and that in itself will lead to, in the short term, paralysis. So, no deal Brexit is a real concern, and those delays are things which we are going to have to deal with in one way or another. Now, let's take something like, say, food supplies. Now, obviously, you look at the United Kingdom, it's a very small place. 65, 66 million people live in the UK. But actually, of course, funnily enough, it doesn't make very much of its own food, or rather, we import roughly, 50% of our own food. We get 30% of our food from the European Union. And of course, we find ourselves in a position where we've got, say, 4% of our food from Africa, 4% from North America, South America, Asia, and of course Australasia, 1%. So actually, funnily enough, the first thing that most people are concerned about is, will there be enough food in the shops? And of course the concern is, of course, is that if the trucks can't make it from, say, Spain or the Netherlands, we will not have enough food to actually sustain the population. So what kind of food will be missing? Well, I think most of the food that actually be missing will be things like, say, stuff like lettuces, for example. 90% of our lettuces are imported, 80% of our tomatoes, 70% of our soft fruit. The UK does produce 57% of its own vegetables, but only 60% of its fruit overall. So actually, the UK will suddenly find itself in a position whereby there will not sufficient fresh food to actually go around if there are significant delays. And the worry is that, of course, if these delays happen at the ports, then of course the food will simply, in the case of lettuces or tomatoes, the food will rot rather than actually make it to the markets. So that's importing food. Exporting food, of course, as well is an issue, because of course the UK does export quite high quality foods, cheeses, certain amount of Welsh lamb, all these kind of products, and of course our farmers will suffer because of course they can't sell it overseas. But I think that's probably one of the less order of concern. So, moving on to the main theme then. Who does the UK trade with? And here's a chart which actually comes from the Office of National Statistics. And of course what we see, of course, is our biggest trading partner, curiously enough, is the United States. And of course, that's because of the simple size of the USA. The USA has got 315 million people. It's much bigger than all the EU states. So the biggest EU state is Germany, 82 million. USA is about 315 million. So what we see, of course, is that the US, we, of course, export a lot of things to the US. But, of course, when we import stuff from the US, there are some issues. It's not really just a question of stuff coming from the US to the UK market, because the United States would very much like to have access to our agricultural market and sell us food and that kind of thing. But of course, American food standards are very different. So people in the UK complain about the fact that, well, the two favourite ones are hormones being injected into beef, and of course, chicken being washed in chlorine to actually remove the feathers and all that kind of thing. So there are some real concerns. Whether those are genuinely health concerns or whether they're trade concerns is another issue. Then, of course, we see here that Germany, Netherlands, France, and only when we get right the way down here do we see that China, of course, is a big market for us. But interesting here, of course, is with China, we find ourselves in a position whereby we import almost double the amount we export to them. Next it's Ireland, next it's Spain, Belgium, Italy, Switzerland. So, Brexit, if it happens, it will make more barriers to the main trading partners that we actually have. Quite significant barriers in some cases. And of course that's to gain the trade in physical goods. What we have to understand as well, of course, is that the trade in services is very, very strong in terms of the European market. And it's this thing called, as I mentioned before, the gravity model. Service trade tends to be with your closest markets. Goods trades tends to be with the closest markets. The exception to that being, of course, with some of the manufactured goods which come from places like, say, China and Japan and so on. But these are the main markets. Now, if we leave the European Union, the UK will then find itself in a position where it actually needs to, as part of its obligations to the World Trade Organization, to impose tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. And what those tariffs will be is still quite up in the air, but there are some indications from the government, the UK government, about what those might be. Usually, of course, these tariffs are subject to international agreements. Now, as I think the point I was trying to make is, of course, is that the UK hasn't really completed these agreements properly yet. So, in fact, these are very much in the sort of negotiation stages, really, of the exercise. So, really, 29th of March really does look very bad. But what we have to remember, though, because many of these international markets are very small, here's a very good example. If we look at, say, the UK's exports to Austria, they are just about as significant as the exports to Brazil. Now, Brazil is a huge country, massive population. Austria is a tiny country. That's because, the reason why that happens is because Austria is close by, Brazil is a long way away, and of course, the other big thing is Austria is much richer than Brazil per head. And of course, the tariffs themselves, well, these are, considering they may be applied in 2 weeks' time, are quite limited in terms of actually what we normally know about them. But yesterday we actually did hear that the tariffs were likely to be. Here's an interesting one, for example. The tariff on cars would be 10.5%, the tariff on buses would be 12.5%, and of course the tariff on chickens would be 60%. Curiously enough, there'd probably be no tariffs on eggs. Now, why is that? Well, obviously the UK is seeking to protect the UK car industry with the tariff on cars, buses just the same, and of course farmers with the chickens. But really the implications for that are that the UK would find itself in a position whereby it's imposing tariffs on cars, but then the cost of the average German car or Czech car would go up between £1,500 and £2,000, which would be, well, it'd be a burden that people have to bear. But the idea behind that, of course, is that it's a negotiation tool, because when we deal with finally settle our trade agreements with the European Union, we can actually fix the actual proper position. Also, it will help to protect UK jobs. So these tariffs are, as I say, coming in, but also, of course, interestingly, the huge debate around Brexit is around particularly the issue about what will happen with the UK's one and only land border, which is the land border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. And of course, at the moment, the proposal is to have no tariffs at all. Now, that in itself will lead to some kind of trade distortion if that remains for a long time, because of course what will happen is that if you have to pay say 12.5% on buying a car from say France, but you can actually buy the same car from the Irish Republic with no tariffs, then of course many people will start to buy cars in Ireland to import them into the UK. So, at the moment, it's very unclear where the whole process is leading. I mean, you'd think that I would be able to give you a degree of certainty about all this, but actually, of course, I can't. All I can say to you is that we have had some tariffs suggested. We do know that we are still going to be very, very dependent upon the European markets, and we now wait to see what the final conclusion of the political process is, which is taking place in the next couple of weeks. But it's likely that there will be a delay in the whole Brexit process. The delay could be as much as 2 years, or we have a complete rethink of the process, or a question of only a couple of months as we finally pass through the legislation in the UK. Overall, though, this poses a significant economic threat to businesses who like the idea of a degree of certainty. And of course, what is very clear is that it's very, very difficult for businesses to switch from the European market to the international market simply because we have not got the presence there. The only place we've got a significant presence is the United States. Places like, say, New Zealand, Australia, far too remote for us to actually send British goods. And so it's likely that even after all the dust is settled, we will have to do business largely with the European Union itself. So Brexit, in a way, it's about exit from the European Union, but of course, it's very, very difficult to actually leave. Thank you.
So we have a couple of questions, Ian.
Yeah.
So the first one being, why is there so much uncertainty around the use of the World Trade Organization rules?
Okay. Well, first of all, of course, the World Trade Organization rules has tied in with it a whole lot of other trade negotiations. And of course, the rules themselves are simply that whatever deal you do with one person, you do have to deal with somebody else. So they have this thing called the most favored nation clause in all WTO agreements. So basically the WTO says, okay, if you can have tariffs, you can have tax on the goods coming into your country, but if you offer a tariff concession to one country, you have to offer it to everybody else. And that means, of course, that actually who we share access to our market with becomes much more problematic. The European Union used to deal with all that for us. now we have to deal with it ourselves. Also, of course, that within those rules, there's a whole lot of trade relationships with countries like, say, Japan, China, a whole range of countries. And of course, we actually have to then decide on what those relationships are likely to be like. So whether we have specific European Union relationships, like, say, with Mexico or Australia, we need to actually now replicate those in terms of the UK. And that task has not been done.
So building on that, one of the next questions we've got are what are the prospects for the trade with countries such as those that you've just named outside of the EU?
Well, apart from the US, most of these countries are of little consequence in the overall grand scheme of things compared to the European Union. So the problem we have essentially is this, that trade with Austria is worth more to us, or as much to us, as trade with a massive country like Brazil. The two big beasts in the jungle are China, and with China, of course, we're a huge importer of goods, and, of course, the US, which is a big export market. So we have to decide whether we're going to actually try and sell more to the United States. But actually, of course, we sell a heck of a lot now. We sell a huge amount of, almost double the amount of exports to the US as we get in terms of imports from the US. So what will happen as a result of all this is that the US will be looking for more goods from the US coming into the UK. Hence, of course, the discussions about agricultural products. The Americans would like to sell us more food. And also, they would like access to things like the UK's medical services. They've got a very big private healthcare provision, and they would see that as been a major market. The National Health Service is a huge organisation. Could the Americans offer more in that area?
So I've got another question that's just come in. Do you think this will impact items such as day-to-day administration with companies? At the moment we have agreements in place. Do you think everything would need reviewing from the ground up to make it work?
Yeah, I do. I actually think that lots of businesses are saying, this is a challenge and we're going to meet it, yeah? But what else would they say? You know, they had the owner of Norton Motorcycles was saying, oh, he's very much in favour of staying in the European Union, but now he sees enormous opportunities in the global market. Where would those opportunities be? They're already there with the US, so he doesn't need to, that was not new. So where would he sell his motorcycles? Very difficult to say, because actually, of course, most of the lower end of the motorcycle trade is being taken care of by the Chinese, and most of the higher level of the motorcycle trade is being taken by the Germans and the Italians.
So one final question then. With changes to border controls representing one of the bigger challenges to supply chains for those that use just-in-time delivery, so manufacturing food industries, what could be done to help mitigate against that? Well, the first most obvious thing is not leave the European Union at all. That would solve the problem immediately. But if you're looking for post-Brexit things, then of course what we need to do is actually work out some kind of trade deal which actually removes the need to actually have detailed border controls. And one of the big Brexit debates is, should we belong to the European Union's customs union or should we not? We need to have a kind of degree of certainty about the way that goods move across. Otherwise, we're simply going to be cut off from the kind of component part of the European Union market, either components coming into the UK or components going out of the UK. But it's to economists, there is no upside to this apart from the fact that we might at some stage get new markets in the future. But those new markets were always available to us anyway. Well, that's it. Thank you very much, Ian.
My pleasure. Okay.